today's weekly workshop. We have the opposite end of the spectrum from last week. So today will be three of our female members giving us a little bit of an insight into what I really love, so I believe, and some high voice music. So see you.
Now, I'll let Helen tell you a little bit more about Orlando later, but with regards to the music, you might have noticed we're all very high voices. We all have quite a similar range in this. So it's really lovely in a way. We're constantly sort of cascading over each other, and that's one of the beauties of these kind of little three-voice pieces. We're so close together. And Lassus, he gets that, he completely gets it, and he knows how to write for us. He writes lots of really close points of imitation where we're constantly copying each other. We've got little canons here and there. And we also, we sing in pairs quite a lot, so I might sing with Helen, and Evie sings something different. Or I sing with Evie, and Helen sings something different. And we're always dipping in and out and sharing those roles, which is really fun. He's also a little bit funky, so he throws in a little bit of cheeky harmony here and there. And yeah, he's just quite clever, really. And I think it's lovely that you probably couldn't tell which part we were singing because it was so close-knit, if you like. Now, the words of the motet we just sung are all about Jesus, surprise, surprise. And it is about the Eucharist, when his body kind of becomes bread and his blood becomes the wine. So it's actually taken from quite a famous hymn. It's from the 13th century, I think, and it's a hymn attributed to Thomas Aquinas, and it's sung pretty much all the time at Eucharist, and particularly around the feast of Corpus Christi. So it's a very sort of little scenic snapshot of what the Eucharist is all about.
Yeah. So the next two pieces we're going to be singing are two comparative settings of the same text. So one was written in the 1590s, and then the other one was, well, it must have still been, Lasso died in 1594, and the collection that we're singing from was printed after his death in 1604. But the second version is one that's only seen for the first time in the collection that we're going to be in the collection in 1604. So we'll sing the two, and then you can see which one you prefer. insight into is some of the mystery, and there's quite a lot of kind of mythology surrounding Lassus as a general figure. So he was born in the that's helpful. So he was born in the early 1500s, and then he lived through until 1594. So he kind of, in regards to quite a lot of other composers from the same time, had quite a long life, and he spent most of his life working at one of the courts in Munich. Although in his youth and in the 1570s, he often just disappeared off to Italy and there's accounts of him going to Rome, and that's when he started setting some more madrigalian and secular texts, mostly setting pieces by Petrarch. And one of the really interesting things about Lassus that makes him stand out as a composer is he was one of the first composers to be recognised for the quality of his work in his own lifetime. And I think in kind of very basically, you can kind of put that down to, in some ways, dumb luck. So the time of luck, or the period that he was living in, was the first kind of big expansion of the printing press. So it was the first time that music was being printed around Europe, and then the books could then be taken and circulated around various places in Europe. So Lassus and his sons, who were both composers as well, Rudolf and Ferdinand, they worked his sons definitely worked with this printer called Henry Nicolai, and Henry Nicolai was based in Munich and inherited the business from the printer who had established it. And I think one of the other reasons that is why we know so much about Lassus and why we have so much of his work is because of his two sons. So his sons, they both worked at the court in Munich alongside their father until he died, and then eventually I think Ferdinand the Younger took over from him in about 1606 or so. And his sons really, they made sure that all of their father's music was printed again after his death. So whether it had been printed beforehand in kind of proper orders. So some of these pieces, like the pieces that we're seeing, they very well may have been part of a larger work, like a mass, and formed an antiphon that would be performed alongside a mass that was based on the same melody and things like that. And the collection that we're seeing from, which was printed in 1604, is the Manuum Opus Musicum. So, big book, music, everything. And the book itself contains 516 motets, ranging from pieces for 2 voices all the way up to 12 plus. And so it is all of Orlando's work. And I think it's just really, it's really fascinating, I think, or to me, just especially as a singer, it's very fascinating because with so much of the music from the same time period, composers, even English composers that you may have heard of, like Ballard or Tallis, they weren't necessarily as recognised in their own time, and I think that's, in some ways that's a shame, but I think it also perhaps shows, gives us some idea of the kind of clouded lens that we as musicians often look through to look back at this music. And we just assume that it's burned. Everyone must have known it at the time, and actually, no, nobody cared. And I think it's really important to kind of recognise that and place it in context. So one of the other peculiarities, especially towards the end of Orlando de Lassus's lifetime, was that within the court that he was working for, the Munich court, the duke that he was working for, Wilhelm, they held a kind of dual role, so he was both kind of governor and kind of the Lord of Munich, as it were, but also the Duke of Bavaria, the overall state. And basically, Wilhelm did not do the best job of that, and they kind of ended up running up into huge amounts of debt. And there's very funny accounts of him having an Italian goldsmith executed because he promised he could turn lead into gold and solve all of Munich's problems, and obviously it was not to be. One of the kind of one of the important things that have impacted Lassus's work, especially, and the whole family's work, was that Wilhelm declared that the only music that would be sung in his court and in his chapel was to be sacred music. So there was no point in Lassus writing any secular music, especially in the later part of his life. And what you see when you kind of examine the kind of span of his collections over the kind of last 20 years of his life is that he's only writing sacred music in this kind of older style, which, especially after being in Italy for 5 years and studying with people on kind of the cutting edge of music, kind of like Palestrina's kind of similar, Palestrina's compatriots, I suppose. You would think that he would be writing in a more modern style, but he doesn't at all. With Wilhelm's decree, he goes back to a very kind of familiar flanking to the counterpoint. So it's absolutely lovely to sing, but it is a kind of a safe bet to not piss off your boss, basically. So our final piece is a setting of GUS2. Sorry, it's over the page. I'm on the right piece. But it's a very fun piece with some flourishes towards the end. And yeah, just thank you very much for coming and thank you for listening. And we'll give this one a go. And I'll say a little bit of
So regarding the talking, the first question that I have is regarding the manuals, for example, and our kind of view of history based on these kind of publications. So these giant publications, plus some poetry making kind of obvious culprits here. How that shapes our knowledge of the period as a whole. Is there an element to say, you said that certain things weren't published during the lifetime and never published in 1604, which is absolutely right, and there's a variety of kind of music that does this. If you take a composer like Philippe de Monte, for example, who was active exactly at the same time, wrote 20, 30 books of naturals plus many books of Mozart, 1,000 plus works, and yet it's barely had a song because there is no manuals, they're all in singular volumes. How big an impact do you think that has? And second of all, chronologically, do we run into issues there because of the fact that something is published in 1604 and we therefore associate style with the publication as opposed to that which might have been 40?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think it does kind of set musicologists up, I think, for a bit of a kind of trapdoor and wrong fall down. But I think it definitely has an impact on who is performed and who isn't, because I would say if you're kind of a student group in Cambridge and you're looking for some music to sing and put together quickly, it's then much easier to scroll through all of Lazarus's works in one go and go, oh yeah, we'll give that a try, we'll give that a try, that will look like it'll fit, fine, than it is to go through 30 separate books of about 20 pieces and do exactly this. And you know, it's the same search in many ways, but it's just a lot more effort. And I'd say, I think, especially when, so something that I neglected to mention, which was a big faux pas in my hand, is that we were performing all of this from the manuscript. So, yeah, so in the manuscript you can only see your own part, and we got very lucky that some kind person on IMSLP had put all of the 3-part pieces into one book and it basically screenshotted each individual page from each individual book. Yeah. So it was a really nice, it was really handy for, yes, absolutely. And it's this is also another barrier to having this music being performed. So for these particular pieces, there are luckily editions in modern score notation, but even then I'd say they're still not massively performed, but given with the kind of general way that especially women's voices and upper voices, music written for upper voices is generally treated as in there's just not much of it and nobody really does it. I think it's nice to see that there are additional vocals that people can sing through this music, but it's still quite rare that you see it being performed. I think also because the pieces are so short, they're only about 30 seconds, so why go to the effort in so much? But it's nice, it's really special to be able to do this as part of seeing and seeing as well for us at least the BBC.
That was my second question.
Yeah.
You just stumbled right to my second question. Which is, how much of a stumbling block is it when you've got difficult music or music that's perceived to be relatively complex and it only lasts for a minute, and therefore there is a question mark over validity or whether there is the time and the effort in order to, you know, to listen to that last piece, for example, which you did very, very well. But it's relatively difficult, and people would a lot of the time sing that through a couple of times and think, actually, I'm not going to bother with this because it's relatively hard and I'm not getting prize. And it only lasts for a minute, so if you were thinking about a concert program or something like that, you would have to do 60 pieces in order to make a program in that sense. So, how much of a stumbling block to performance is that kind of thing?
Well, I think it is, absolutely, but what we can certainly do as musicians and creative people is be a little bit imaginative about how we might perform some of these things. If you think back to how they would have originally been sung, they'd be as part of a service, and the Adoramus Days, which were the really short ones, would be before a psalm or before a hymn, so they're just like little bookends, really. So potentially you could use them in a similar way in a concert program. You could sort of bookend something bigger in the middle. You could think about doing a little bit of choreography and thinking about how you can make it visually a bit more interesting, a bit more fun, so that there's kind of lots going on, lots of potentially kind of grabbing things.
Anybody?
Well, on that point, two other things, I think you're absolutely right. Two other things to think about are quite a few, just looking through that, quite a few of those texts would function as elevation motets. So that moment where everything stops and, you know, the hocus pocus takes place. And so that's one thing, and there was often a motet at that point. The other is domestic use. So the way to justify a 1 minute piece is, well, you're not doing anything sort of sitting at home. And the fact that it has a sacred text doesn't necessarily
Gets you a lot of
I think it's the Agility, the last one was actually more of a sort of post, like a table blessing type.
Yes,
text.
it's very right.
Thanks God, you've given us all these lovely gifts.
Thanks.
Thanks is great. Amen.
I think that's something that, again, like, it's something that I completely glossed over, in that, you know, that's a consideration that, it's not something that in society we would do today, but back then, that's very much a part of daily life, was people would be singing these little pieces and just in their homes, just by themselves for fun.
Well, in colleges we still see
Yeah.
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 And also, you do get, of course, the kind of three-part music, which, as I was saying, the sacred text being, technically appropriate, but also could be contrafacted to other texts. It could also be played by instruments, for example. So you would use, from a domestic environment, what you had around. So it becomes more pragmatic than anything else. The last thing that I just wanted to say is just to you, because of that, this is your first time kind of doing this stuff. So first of all, big congrats. Secondly, the working method. We ask this to these guys all the time, so I'll have to excuse my boring. Do you find it different? What are the challenges that you have to overcome working from parts as opposed to score, and how do you find this in that sense? Do you think it's something which has helped or hindered?
I think it's really interesting. The biggest difference is, of course, not seeing anyone else's part. Most of the time when I'm cycling and stuff in choir, I think harmfully about what all the other parts are doing. And I often don't really kind of count bars, rests, I kind of just follow on the line.
Sure.
I think that's the hardest thing, is just being as highly responsible for one line and not having anything else to help. But I think it's a really good skill to kind of get better at. I think it's a really fun thing to do.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's interesting. I was wondering if you could say anything about the actual fun elements of the music making, because I think that's one of the things that changes a lot. Because you are solely responsible for your own part, there's a lot more morality to it, so you actually have to just listen instead of following something. And the listening kind of enables you to have a bit more fun with it, because once you've got, you have to count for stress or whatever it might be. You don't tend to want to, as a musician, spend all of your time counting at the same level of intensity, so you simply listen for a cue and then just work it off that in that sense. But once you're listening for a cue, you then don't have to count, so you can basically want to switch off a little bit, which allows you to listen and to have fun in that sense. So it really does change, I think, the way of music making. I don't know if you agree with that, but definitely the processing is different in that sense.
Yeah.
So I think in that, for you, I guess it's a nice journey, because you can start out on it and you can learn lots of different things which are not all purely musical in that sense. We tend to think very much from an academic standpoint of, well, am I getting better at being able to score read or something like that? There's a slightly larger pot to work with. Any more? We've got probably space for one more. Anything from your point?
I was going to ask something about the manuscript as well. I was just going to ask about the voicing. Is that for the pieces the original voicing?
Yes.
So for the two sopranos and
So I think there's one of the pieces was all of us on a C1 clef, and then there's a couple of pieces where Aileen and I are on G clefs and Evie's still on C1. But yeah, that's the original voice.
so in the context of a sort of 16th century home, or as you were saying, a dinner table or something, or whatever, it's likely that kids would be singing.
Yeah, I think when we've done previous workshops on kind of two-part music, which is often referred to as Puccini, and I would say I can probably make the same argument I do for Puccini, in that when you've got ones for kind of upper voices, just upper voices, or one lower voice and an upper voice, it's partially just an exercise for the chorister or whoever's on the top line still
Someone
learning.
younger or
Yeah,
something.
yeah. Because I would say I think Evie's part definitely had more kind of, there were a lot of ways when you had kind of more extended like running patterns that were more challenging, say for example in my part, which is just cadence figures. So then if you've got a countertenor or a very low one, so you can do that, then I can make as much mistakes as I want.
Actually, the C1 clef thing, I think an interesting point to make about that, because 3 C1 clefs is actually very rare. So you don't tend to find 3 equal voicings
Yeah.
So
I was quite
didn't
surprised.
know that at the time when you were singing, and that's something to look into. Is one of the things that you do a lot of the time find what they call voce pari repertoire. It's actually very rare that the voices are entirely equal. They do tend to be tiered. It's just that they are able to be performed by either a male voice ensemble or a female voice ensemble. But they are not equal by definition.
I'd say so each part book for the kind of 3-voice extrapolation that we've been using, it's about 50 pieces of 3-part music, and all except we've done 4 today, but there's another final piece. There's 5 pieces that are written for either this kind of voicing, and the rest are all kind of C1, C3, or C4 and a bass.
Which is a lot more sad.
Yeah, exactly.
But it also shows that there is the potential to perform with 3 other voices, which you don't really find in earlier writing.
Yeah.
So it's incredibly rare. It starts around the 60s and moves on surface with us. Okay, let's close.